everyone, welcome back to the second lecture for this week. So in the first lecture, we were talking about juvenile crime statistics and how do we count the amount of juvenile crime that actually exists. This lecture, we're going to move more into talking about a risk assessment. So we're going to look at different factors that make juveniles more likely to become delinquent. And we're going to also look at factors that are more likely to cause a juvenile to be a victim of a crime. And then we'll also look at protective factors. What are the factors that sort of kind of work against that and protect juveniles from becoming victims or delinquents? Once we go through all these factors, then you will do a homework assignment using all the stuff that we learned in the lecture. So let me share my PowerPoint with you. So we're going to look at juveniles, and we're going to talk about juveniles in terms of becoming delinquent or becoming victims. And we're going to look at those kind of factors for today. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my PowerPoint. Okay, now, so just to get us thinking about this along the lines of what we're talking about, I want you to think about what factors do you think affect a child's behavior? What are some of the things that you think would either push somebody towards becoming delinquent or protect them against becoming delinquent? What would you identify as some of the things that would affect children? Do you think it would be family members, or friends, or social groups, or community? So if you thought of any of those, you would probably be right. And that's some of the things that we're going to talk about today. We know that through lots of studies, social science studies, that there are several factors that often either contribute or protect juveniles in certain ways. Okay, so some of these factors fall under big categories. So the first category is child development. So we're going to talk about child development and how emotionally, physically, psychologically children develop and how that can affect later delinquency. We're going to talk about social cognitive development, so brain development and social development. We're going to talk about moral reasoning development. So how does your brain start learning right from wrong morally? We're going to talk about family influences. What influences do they have on this? And socialization, so friends, neighbors, communities. And then we're going to talk about values. So these would be the main factors that affect the possibility of becoming delinquent later or protecting people from becoming delinquent. So let's start off talking about child development. So there's been lots and lots of research on child development and how the different stages of development, what happens to juveniles during those different stages. When you're talking about infancy and childhood, like we're going to summarize this short. I mean, there could be whole classes just on this. But when you're talking about infancy and childhood, we're talking about basically 0 through 11 years, like the younger years. We know that there's a significant amount of brain development, like growth and things like that. Neurotransmitters are connecting and things like that during that time. We also know that any sort of neglect or abuse during this time affects those neurotransmitters from actually forming their connections. We also know that during the infancy and childhood, a lot of social skills are learned through rewards and punishments from parents. So a lot of that is occurring during early childhood. And another thing that occurs during this early childhood is conflict management, conflict resolution. So if you have siblings, the power struggle, sort of the fighting that occurs between siblings is actually part of the growth and development of that juvenile. Then we know from ages 12 through 18, which we will classify as the adolescent years, that it is basically, we're really starting then to transition into adulthood. So this is when you really are given a little bit more privileges and responsibilities as adults, or as quasi-adults, I guess, to start making decisions and sort of taking those social skills and morals and values that you've been learning all these years and kind of putting them in practice. A lot of times during this age, we know that juveniles pretend to be like adults. They want to be adults. So they will put on airs as adults. But the problem is they don't have the necessarily have the social skills and the maturity yet to actually make adult rational decisions. So all of that kind of occurs during this adolescent period. They don't really have that intellectual capacity or maturity yet of the adult, even though they often feel that they are. So these factors affect juvenile delinquency and how a child progresses from infancy, childhood, and adolescence. And what occurs during those time periods can have a direct impact on whether or not a juvenile would ultimately lean towards delinquency or stay away from it. Another big thing that is developing during this whole time is what we call social cognition. So this is sort of like brain development. And there's been a lot of research on this, and Jean Piaget has done a lot of studies and has come up with 4 main periods of sort of this social cognition development that occurs. So there's like a sensormatic period, so 0 through 2 years, they're really little. They're just starting to kind of be aware of themselves. And then pre-operational period, ages 2 through 7. So this is when they start to understand some concrete attributes. They sort of understand some concrete concepts, and they understand emotions like fear and anger and excitement, but they can't necessarily control it, and it has to be guided. Then you have the concrete operational period. So this is when you have your personality traits start to emerge and come through. And then you have the operational period, the formal operational period. And this is when you can start doing more complex reasoning and rationalization and description, or concrete, precise descriptions and traits, and you start to realize the distinctions between people. So those are kind of the steps you go through for social cognition. Again, just like child development, if something is different in these stages, the idea is that if they're not progressing through this properly, it could be an increased risk of delinquency at a later time. Now, this man, Lawrence Kohlberg, he then built off of the idea of social cognition and started to say, okay, not only do you have brain social development, you also have moral reasoning development. And you start to morally reason at different stages. So your brain and your ability to take a situation, analyze a situation, and make moral and value decisions on that situation occur in 6 distinct stages. And these just roughly describe them. So your first stage is the idea that rules are very rigid and absolute. So you have set rules. And a lot of times during this first stage, it's your brain, your brain is considering, how do I avoid punishment? So your sole fixation is, okay, there's a rule. How do I avoid getting punished with this rule? We also have then self-interest during this time. So you judge your actions according to individual needs. And so then you start thinking about it, what's in it for me? Okay. So you start to evolve a little bit. First, you're just like, I don't want to get punished. Then you're thinking, well, what's in it for me? You're starting to make morals and value judgments at this point. Then you have stage 3, you start to conform with being nice. So you start to recognize that there's good boys, there's good girls, and you start to want to conform your behavior to fit that description of what would qualify as a good boy or a good girl. And then you have respecting authority. So you would keep progressing through this moral development. And in stage 4, you start to recognize authority and social order. Not just, I don't want to get in trouble, but you start to recognize the need for authority and social order within the world. And you start to understand morality based in this concept. You want to respect the rules and authority because those are the morals and values that you've been trained. And then you have people start to consider others. You start to think about other people and others' individual needs and rights. So you start to have these social connections with other people, and not just worrying about yourself, but also worrying about society as a whole. And then the most advanced is that you understand these moral values and apply them with your ethical principles and reasoning skills. So you're taking the morals and values now that you have accumulated over this development, and you're starting to use those to make rational decisions. Okay, so all of this progresses at different ages. They're loosely associated with ages, but people progress through this moral reasoning development at different paces. So again, how somebody progresses through this process could affect whether or not they're more likely to become delinquent. Now, with this Clausberg thing, he used this one Heinz Dilemma to assess how people were progressing through this moral development. So I just thought it was interesting. I thought I would share. A woman is near death with cancer. There's only one drug that there's only one drug doctors say could save her life. It's a form of radium that a druggist in a nearby town has discovered. The drug is expensive to make, but the druggist is charging 10 times what it is to make it. So he pays $200 for the radium, but then he's charging $2,000 for even a small dose. A sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow money so he could get this drug, but he could only get together about $1,000. He told the druggist his wife was dying and begged him to sell it to him cheaper or allow him to pay for it in like installments or later. But the druggist said, no, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money off of it. So Heinz becomes desperate and broke into the man's store and stole the drug. So how you would answer your thoughts on this question would have kind of demonstrate where you are along that moral development. So the question is, should Heinz have broken into the laboratory to steal the drug for his wife? Why or why not? So where you fit, is it, were you just trying to escape punishment? Or were you assessing what's in it for you? Or were you trying to be a good person? If you're just assessing on good person, maybe he's not a good person because he's committing a crime. Maybe the druggist isn't a nice person for not selling it. Are you respecting authority? Are you making decisions about authority? Are you considering other people's rights? Are you applying all of these ethical principles in an abstract way to kind of make a decision on how you would behave? So you could use this dilemma to kind of assess where people were along their moral development. And when you're talking about juveniles, maybe some juveniles are committing crime because they're not quite far enough in that moral development and in their rational decision-making process. So we know that moral development also can be a factor that could contribute to later delinquency. Or if you have advanced moral development, maybe it protects you from becoming delinquent. Okay. Now we know there's some other factors that always have to be considered along these lines. Child rearing and parenting practices. So we know that the actual parental involvement in the child's life and how they're raised has a significant effect on potential for future delinquency. Socialization, how well the juvenile is being socialized into society and socializing with peers. And then the values that they're taught from their parents. So these are other factors that need to be considered when deciding if somebody is more likely a risk to become delinquent or more protected from becoming delinquent. Okay, so when you put all of this knowledge that we have, all this research on development and ethics and your social cognitive behavior, and you take all of these things, plus you put them together with all the stats that we talked about in the last lecture on who's committing crimes and when they're committing crimes, then we can start to put together what we call a risk assessment. So we're using all this research and all this data to start to put together a puzzle and come up with lists of factors that are, if people have these factors, maybe they're more likely to turn to delinquency. And if they don't have these factors or they have other protective factors, they're more likely to stay away from delinquency. Okay, so those are some of the things that we can put together with all this research. Why do we care? Well, if we know certain factors are more likely to lead to delinquency, we want to reduce those factors. If we know there's more factors that protect against delinquency, we want to increase those factors in a juvenile's life. Okay, it'll probably make more sense when we start talking about the factors. So 2 things that we're going to talk about risk of today. First, we're going to talk about the risk of a juvenile becoming a victim of a crime. So we're going to talk about the risk of victimization. What things do juveniles do that put them at risk to being a victim? And then we want to talk about the risk of becoming delinquent. What factors in a juvenile's life push them more likely to the idea of that they could start committing delinquent acts? Okay, so we're going to break it down in those 2 categories. Now, before we get into the specific factors, I want to make something clear. I want to clear up some definitions. So the first one is what we call causal factor. A causal factor is something that we believe actually causes something to happen. So if it's a causal factor, it's something we can point to and said, this specifically caused delinquency. We're not really talking about causal factors today. We're talking about what we call risk factors or protective factors. These are variables that, if they're present, are more likely to increase delinquency or are more likely to protect juveniles from becoming delinquent. They're not direct causation. We can't say if you have this factor, you will absolutely become delinquent. They are just things that we can look at and see that they may pose a risk of becoming more delinquent. Okay? So please remember that risk protective factors do not always mean causal factor. So some of you may see some of these factors that happen in your life and you'll be like, yeah, but I didn't become delinquent. Well, that's true, because not all of these factors absolutely lead to delinquency. They just could contribute to more likelihood of becoming delinquent. And the more risk factors you have, the more risk you have of becoming delinquent. Okay, but don't just assume that they are going to automatically become delinquent just because they have these factors. Okay, oops, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to do that. I meant to click. Okay, now, so we're going to start with what we call risk of victimization. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the idea of what factors are more likely to lead a person into becoming a victim. So they're not committing the delinquent acts themselves. They are likely to become the victim of some sort of delinquent act, or it could be adult crime. Okay, so that's what we're going to start talking about. So before we even get to that, I want to talk about victim, and we did kind of talk about this in the last class. So what actually is a victim? How do we define victim? And a victim is just a person who experiences harm, injury, loss, or death. So it could be one or multiple of these, and that is how we define a victim. Okay, so if you were harmed by somebody or injured by somebody, then you are a victim. Okay, or if your family member could be that, then you're a family member of a victim. Okay, so those are the types of, that's what we're referring to when we refer to the term victim. Okay, so what makes someone a victim? One of these things happening to them. Now, it's really important to remember anyone can be a victim. You could try to do everything perfect in your life and you could still be a victim of a crime because you can't control other people's actions. So anyone can be a victim. So it doesn't mean that. But what it means is there are certain people that are more likely to become victims because they have higher risk. So their behaviors or their lifestyle or something that's going on puts them at a higher risk of becoming a victim. So that although everybody can be a victim, that doesn't mean everyone has equal risk of being a victim. Okay. So when we talk about victimology and we talk about who's at a greater risk of becoming a victim, we say, well, why? Why do we even want to know this? What importance does this have to criminal justice or juvenile justice? Well, the idea is if we can assess this, if we can assess what lifestyle choices, what behaviors, what social interactions are more likely to lead somebody to become a victim, then we can try to make changes in their environment to reduce their risk of victimization. Okay, so by finding out what risk factors existed, which were more likely to cause them to be a victim, maybe we can educate and provide counseling and mentoring to remove some of those risks from the juvenile's life, so then they won't become victims. So that's why it becomes important study. Now, when you're talking about victim risk, you're talking about how high of a risk is that person. So this is a very subjective thing. It's, not like a set rule, like a math problem, you're always going to have the same answer. Different people can look at this and reach different results. And you'll see when we look at the factors are very subjective. So you have to remember this is sort of somebody's opinion. So somebody's going to look at the information and try to just make a assessment the best they can based on their education and knowledge of these factors. So when they're making this risk assessment, they can basically rank the lit risk. Are they a low risk, a medium risk, or a high risk? Now, these levels also exist for risk for delinquency. Right now, we're talking about risk of victimization. So what could somebody do that would make them a low risk victim, a medium risk victim? They live in some risky conditions, or do they have a lifestyle that puts them at risk for a lot of crime occurring? Okay. So when you think about this, think about what kind of lifestyles or social environments would fall into each level of risk, right? Do you live in a community that has a lot of crime? If you do, that might put you at a higher risk of becoming a victim then. If you live in a very low risk community, then you're very low risk of becoming a victim. How you live and who you hang around with. If you hang around super law-abiding, diligent students and friends, and nobody in your family ever commits crime, you're going to be a lower risk of victimization yourself. Where if you are hanging around a lot of people engaging in very risky behavior, drug use, staying up all night, hanging around bad areas, then you're going to be at a much higher risk to become a victim. So you can kind of assess where the person's lifestyle and social environments put them according to risk. How likely is it that they could become a risk for the victimization? So how do we assess this? We have to talk to the juveniles. You have to ask them questions. You have to interview them. It can be very difficult to do because it could be emotional. They may not want to talk about it. They may be embarrassed or defiant. They may not want to talk to you. You may want to talk to them about timeline of events, like if they're engaged in something where they are a victim, what led up to that to lead to their victimization. They may be able to narrow down suspects if they were a victim, who could be the one that caused them to be a victim, who committed the act. But a lot of juveniles may be unwilling to share this information. They could think that it's private. It could be a family matter. It could be crisis in their family or with their friends. They don't want to be a narc and turn in their family or friends. It could be embarrassing to them. It could be like sexual assault or sexual abuse that they just don't want to talk about. It's too embarrassing for them to discuss these things. So oftentimes we try to assess the risk of victimization, but if the juveniles aren't able or willing to communicate with the interviewer, it may be really difficult to accurately assess risk level because you may not be getting accurate information from the juvenile. Okay, so just kind of thinking along those lines, I have a couple examples for you to think about. Adriana is a high school student driving back to her home at 9 p.m. She stops at a gas station to fill up her gas tank. She gets back in her car and drives away. About 5 miles down the road, a man leans forward from her back seat, puts a knife to her neck, and makes her pull over and sexually assaults her. And then he flees. So who is the victim? Obviously, Adriana is the victim. What factors make you figure that out? Well, she was physically, obviously, and emotionally harmed in some way. So she's the one that fits the definition of victim. Now, when we assess her risk, what was her risk to becoming a victim? Well, she's a high school student. She was just driving home. It was 9 o'clock. It wasn't super late. It wasn't risky behavior. She stopped at a well-lit gas station. She just filled her gas. I mean, you may have questions like, did she walk away from her car without locking it? Maybe that was more risky behavior, right? She didn't check her back seat. Maybe that's a little riskier behavior, but I still would not ever put her in a high risk. She's not really doing any sort of high risk behavior. So she has a relatively low risk of being a victim. She's still a victim. It can happen to anyone, but she wasn't living a risky lifestyle that put her at a high risk of becoming a victim. Now, compare this to this. One evening, 2 a.m., Marcus is only 16. He leaves a friend's house. He has had several drinks. He's severely intoxicated. He's stumbling around. He heads down a dark alley towards his home. On his way, he is held at gunpoint and mugged. In the process, he starts struggling with the perpetrator, and he wants to protect his belongings. And he turns the gun on the perpetrator, and he ends up killing the perpetrator. So now who's the victim? Is the victim the perpetrator? Is the victim Marcus? You know, I would still argue that Marcus is the victim because he was the one that is assaulted and harmed, even though he did then harm somebody else. Now, I know it could be self-defense, and I know you're probably thinking a lot of other things. It would, most likely be that. But, it's just something to think about. But he's definitely the victim because the perpetrator started the whole thing. But now you start to assess what was his behavior and how risky was his behavior. Now, I'm not making a judgment call. I'm not, persecuting this person, but you have to start thinking about behaviors and what's the likelihood of certain behaviors increasing your risk of victimization. So out at 2 o'clock in the morning, my mom used to always say nothing good happens after 10 p.m. So maybe you put that in a risk category. He was drinking heavily. He's only 16 and he's drinking heavily. He's really intoxicated. He walks home alone. He chooses to walk in a dark alley. Okay. He chooses to fight for his limited possessions instead of giving them up. Now, I am not victim blaming in any way, and that's a huge phenomenon with victimology is victim blaming. Point the finger at the victim and say it's your fault that you're the victim. That is not the point of risk assessment. The point of risk assessment is to figure out what factors are more likely to cause somebody to become a victim. If we can start identifying some of those factors, maybe we provide mentoring or education or discussion with juveniles that these certain factors are contributing more likely to becoming a victim. So when making choices in order to avoid being a victim, use these factors in your decision making, okay? So don't equate pointing out risk factors for victimization as the same thing as blaming. Nobody's blaming. Marcus didn't do anything that caused him to deserve this. Walking alone doesn't mean you deserve this. Walking alone doesn't mean you should be robbed. Drinking doesn't mean you deserve this. Drinking doesn't mean that you should be robbed. But it's assessing those factors and making people aware if you engage in this behavior, you have a higher risk of becoming a victim. Okay? So that's risk of victimization. Now let's switch and talk about risk of becoming delinquent. So just like becoming a victim, anyone can become delinquent, but there are certain factors that may make certain juveniles more likely to become delinquent. So anyone can be delinquent, but that doesn't mean everyone has equal risk of being delinquent. So we're going to look at the factors surrounding a juvenile's life that could influence them more likely to become delinquent or protect them from becoming delinquent. Again, not causation. We're not saying any of these factors by themselves cause somebody to become delinquent. We're just saying that they compose a risk to juveniles to push them towards delinquency more than other factors. Okay. Now,
What are some of these categories? Well, you have different risk and protective factor categories. So we're going to talk about these risk factors, things that are more of a risk to cause delinquency. And then we're going to look at these same 5 factors and think about how certain parts of them can be protective and keep people from becoming delinquent. So we're going to look at individual risk factors. We're going to look at family risk factors, social, environment, or peer risk factors. We're going to talk about community factors and educational factors. So those are going to be the main categories that we look at. Okay, so let's first talk about individual risk factors. Again, not any of these one things causes delinquency. It's just a factor to consider. Is this child more likely to become delinquent? So a lot of research has gone into this, and they have found that people that have a lower IQ can be more risky of delinquent behavior. So they may be pushed more towards risky behavior. We know being a member of a minority race can be riskier for delinquent behavior. We know males, if you're a male, you're at a higher risk of becoming delinquent. So a lot of that is based on crime statistics that we talked about. Okay, so we know a lot of that. So low IQ is often linked to socioeconomic status and finance and things like that, that could push more towards the risk of becoming delinquent. So we know that race, there's no difference between African American and Caucasian boys at age 6, but as you progress through adolescence, the risk of becoming delinquent, if you're in a minority race, increases as age increases. That's what the statistics show. And then we know that boys are more likely to become involved in delinquent behavior than girls. Not always, but that is one of the factors. We also know that female delinquency is increasing, and we're going to talk a lot about female delinquency over the next couple of weeks. We'll talk about that. And then we now know females are starting to commit more property crimes. So it's not always male, but it's one of the factors. We also know that an individual risk is if somebody suffers from an antisocial or aggressive behavior. So if they tend to be very antisocial, if they're very stubborn, they don't get along with people, they exhibit signs of aggression, fighting, things like that, that's a factor to be concerned about, that they may become more delinquent. If they suffer from certain disorders, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, these are special diagnostic disorders. They may be more persistently defiant and not following rules and procedures. It puts them at a higher risk of becoming delinquent. We know if they have developmental or cognitive disabilities. So when we talked about child development and social cognitive development and moral development, we know that if you have difficulties or aren't progressing through that at what they would consider the typical progression, that is a risk to lean more towards the possibility this person could commit delinquent acts. And then we know lifestyle changes. So drugs, alcohol, friends, who you're choosing to hang around, those are all going to be factors that can contribute to a higher risk of becoming delinquent. Now, we also know that family can create a risk of becoming delinquent. So some of the stronger factors are your parents. Are the juvenile's parents involved in crime or incarcerated? That could be a risk factor. Are parents separated or divorced? Are you, if you're a girl and you live in a single parent household, that is a contributing risk factor for delinquency, just for girls. Maltreatment, abuse, things like that can be a risk factor to lead children more towards delinquent acts. Lack of parental supervision or parental involvement in their a juvenile's life, no real bonding with the parents, emotional bonding with the parents,
So those are all risk factors that could lead to more likely engaging in delinquent acts. It also includes things like if the parent has their own psychological issues, depression, anxiety, or the parent is suffering from severe health issues. Those are also issues to worry about increasing the risk of delinquency. And then if you have siblings that are delinquent already, that's a risk factor for delinquency. So that it just makes you think, what is it about the family that leads to delinquency in childhood? So you have to think about, why does the family, some of the previous ones, individual, were genetic types of things that the juvenile may not even have any control over. And then we have these family risks that often are some huge risk factors for a juvenile becoming delinquent. And you have to ask yourselves why, right? Why is the family so influential? Well, because they are really a significant part in that child's development at all ages, early childhood through adolescence. Then we have social environment or peer risk factors. So how social a juvenile is, how integrated they feel socially with other people. Do they have peers that they interact with? Do they have any mentors or anything that will help them? Are they rejected by their peers, or do they have healthy relationships with peers? Are they hanging around peers that are engaged in risky behavior themselves, drinking, alcohol, gangs, all of those types of things? Are they aggressive, the peers you hang around? So if you remember, as you were growing up, your parents probably say guilt by association. You are like who you hang around. And that is the argument, that if you're hanging around this social peer group that is engaging in risky behavior, it's going to increase the risk that that juvenile is also going to become delinquent. Okay, so when you think about this, there's a couple phrases people say. Poverty predicts delinquency. So if you're in a social environment of extreme poverty, does that predict delinquency? Or idle hands are the devil's workshop. So keep your kids busy. You give them too much free time to be with their peers or social environment, then they're going to be more likely to engage in delinquent acts. So it kind of gets you thinking about those social factors. Another factor are what we call community risks. So not only just socialization, but the community that you are living in and you're working in, okay? So if you were in a neighborhood that is very unorganized and there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of drugs and gangs going on, that is a risk factor for that juvenile to be more likely to become delinquent. Not always, but it's more of a risk factor. What about the availability of firearms in that community? Alcohol, drugs, instability, disorganization, a really hectic community. Every time you walk to school through your community, your life is at risk. Very disadvantaged, high poverty areas, again, unorganized, increases the likelihood of delinquency. We know some juveniles that are in very good neighborhoods still become delinquent. So it's not dispositive, but it is a factor that could pose a significant risk. Okay, no real attachment to the community, something like that also. So to get you thinking, if you want to keep your kids from using drugs, raise them in the country. So this goes more towards the idea like that we talked about, is there less delinquency in the country than in cities? And or is it that they just get caught more likely if you're in an urban setting because there's more police around to see you? So there's all kinds of questions that are raised with these community risk factors. And then the last category is what we're going to call educational risk factors. So how well does the juvenile connect to school? So the school themselves, do they feel any connection? Do they feel part of a school community? Are they involved in any school activities? What's their attitude towards school? Do they like school? Do they enjoy going? Do they have a desire to learn? How well are they performing? We know intellectual disabilities and struggles in school can increase the risk of delinquent behavior. And then the attitude of the adults in school, right? Do you have mentors, or do juveniles have mentors or people that they look up to in the school setting? Or is it a very negative bad environment where the children can't connect to their teachers and things like that in that environment. So you have to look at those educational risk factors also. So when you think about all of these categories, so individual, family, social, peer, community, education, if you had to pick one category that you think is the most predictive, which one would it be? Which one do you think has the most impact on whether or not a juvenile becomes delinquent? And I don't think there's a right answer. I think that there's a lot of research on all of them, and they debate this all the time. If you think one category is more dispositive of possible delinquency than others, then maybe you come up with policies and procedures in that one area to try to resolve some of those risks and keep juveniles from falling into those risk categories. The general belief is that it's accumulation of risk factors. So it's generally not just one single risk factor. It's going to be how many of these risk factors are in your life. So the more risk factors that you have, the more likely you're going to engage in delinquent acts. Where if you can reduce some of these risk factors, it may reduce the chance that the juvenile would commit delinquent acts. Okay. So those are all what we call risk factors. So now I want to look at some factors that we would consider protective factors. So these are factors that would reduce the likelihood of a juvenile becoming delinquent. Okay. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you are protected from becoming a juvenile delinquent. You could have all of these protective factors, and a person could, of their own free will, still choose to commit a delinquent act. So it's not necessarily causation. Having protective factors doesn't keep you from becoming delinquent. It just reduces the risk. And a lot of these are just the opposite of what we talked about with risk factors. So you can look at each of these categories again: individual protective factors, family protective factors, educational protective factors, social peer protective factors, and community protective factors. And each of them have their own group of facts. So individual, so it's the opposite. You come from a healthy environment, healthy lifestyle, active, eating nutritious. You have high expectations for yourself. You have high IQ. You have a lot of social support. You are self-efficacy. So you can reflect on yourself and realize what you're doing right and wrong. So those are being female is a protective factor. So those are individual protective factors. Protective factors for family. You have effective parents that are effectively making choices on how to parent you. You have good relationships with your parents. You have attachment and bonding with the parents. You have a stable, predictive family life. So you know basically what to expect every day. You're not constantly living in fear that something bad could happen in your family every day. It's kind of a stable, predictive life. You have an opportunity to interact with your family members, and you get positive rewards from the interaction with your family members. Educational protective factors would be you have a connection to your school. You have a social network in that school. You're involved in activities within your school. You have a high quality of education. You're actually learning in a learning environment. You have positive role models and teachers in that schooling environment. You have good reading and math scores. They've correlated as a protective factor against delinquency. You're rewarded for being pro-social in your school and engaging in social activities. You're rewarded either with friends or some social reward or school reward for that. And you have bonding with the people in your school. Social peer protective factors. You have good relationships with friends. You're confident in your friend group. You have the ability to be with friends and interact with your friends. Your friends are making good choices. You're with a group that's making good choices. Those would all be social peer protective factors. And then community protective factors. You live in a low crime area.
maybe in a more rural setting would be protective factor. Your community has clear norms and values that everybody sort of follows in their daily lives. You live in a safe environment. You're not worried every time you walk out your door that you're going to be shot or a gang's going to beat you up or there's going to be crime occurring everywhere. So you have a safe environment. You have rewards for interacting and participating in your community. You're encouraged to do that. There's opportunities for that, and you receive rewards for that. And that your neighborhood has some actual resources. They have after school programs, they have sports, they have parks, they have things that are resources that juveniles can use. Those are something that could be a protective factor. Okay, so what you're going to do for your chapter 2 assignment, you're going to read the scenario and you're going to assess the risk factors for the juvenile and the protective factors for the juvenile. Now, I can't give you every single fact that exists. So if there's something missing that you think is significant, write it and say, I would want to know this. You can point those things out. And then you're going to assess what is the likelihood that this juvenile is likely to become delinquent based on the fact. It doesn't mean that juvenile will become delinquent. It just means if you were doing a risk assessment, how would you assess this risk? What is the likelihood? Okay. Now, before you do that, one thing you may want to do, I'm going to do it in class, but obviously if you're online, I can't do it with you. Oh, before I forget, I forgot. Your word for this lecture is protective factors. So make sure you stop the video, write it down. Protective factors is the word for this lecture. Okay. So one of the things to help you with this is to look at in the weekly materials I posted that's called Risk and Protective Factors Reference Sheet. You can open it and look at it, or you can print it out, and it breaks all the categories down and all the subcategories under each of those headings. So if you have this, you can kind of review it and see more detail than what I said during the lecture. Now, to get you thinking about this, pick one of them and really think about the items that are listed in that list. And identify which 3 of those factors do you think were the most risky to cause delinquency? And then out of the protective factors, which 3 factors do you think are most protective? Okay, so think through it. If you're critically assessing and thinking about these factors, it's going to get them built in your head more and you'll understand what they are a little bit more. Okay, so look at that reference sheet, kind of think through what are the 3 most risky out of each category, what are the 3 least risky, so that you kind of have an understanding and functional use of each of these factors. And then that would help you when you go to do your chapter 2 assignment, you'll have them in your head and it will make your assessment go a little easier. Okay. So that is the end of the second part of chapter 2. So the risk assessment. So we talked about crime stats, then we talked about risk assessment. So that is the end for week 2. Okay. So next week, because it's the end of week 2, now it's time for your first exam. So make sure that you're reviewing the information and getting ready for exam 1. Okay. Next week is a little different. Next week, we're going to actually read the appendix of the book. So instead of making it a separate chapter, they did this whole appendix on female delinquency. So that's what we're going to look at next week. Our reading is going to be out of the appendix. So don't get confused. Okay. So we'll start a new unit next week. We'll talk about female delinquency. Then we'll talk about causes of delinquency. And then we're about ready for your juvenile rights projects. Okay. So keep working on your juvenile rights projects and putting that together, because in a couple of weeks, you'll have to present. Okay. Well, thank you for listening. I hope that it was informational for you. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out. I'm always around. I can always help you with anything you need. Don't ever be afraid to ask. So have a good night, and I will see you next week.